Sofía Morales let her left hand hover above the piano keys for one last heartbeat, as if the air itself were begging her to stop. The ballroom glittered with silver balloons and curling ribbons, the kind of luxury that made a working girl feel invisible, even while standing under chandeliers. Behind her, the manager, Mr. Klein, wore a tight, rehearsed smile, a shove disguised as politeness. "Just play," his eyes insisted, like she was part of the decoration. Sofía lowered her fingers, and the first notes rose, soft, old, and far too intimate for a room like this. For a moment, the guests kept sipping and smiling, assuming it was background music, something to float beneath their conversations. Then the atmosphere changed in a way no one could explain, like a candle snuffed out without a breeze. Laughter thinned, voices fractured, and even the clink of crystal sounded suddenly too loud. A banner reading, "Happy New Year," swayed above the tables, cheerful and wrong, like a joke told at a funeral. Sofía kept her eyes on the keys, but she felt the room's attention gathering weight, as if every expensive breath had turned toward her at once. Across the floor, Graham Whitmore froze mid-step. He was the kind of man known for controlling everything. His money could bend a room without him raising his voice. Yet now his face drained of color, as if the melody had reached inside him and pulled. His hand rose to cover his mouth, not for drama, but by instinct, as though he were stopping a sound from breaking loose. Sofía's fingers kept moving, though her pulse thundered high in her throat. She had learned this melody in a cramped apartment, her mother folding laundry and humming like it was a prayer, never explained, never discussed, only repeated with a tenderness that carried something locked away. Now the tenderness filled the ballroom, and it didn't belong among diamonds. A woman near the front released a nervous laugh and swallowed it the moment she saw Graham's eyes shine. Phones began to lift, hungry for scandal, while staff traded warning glances that said, "This will end badly." Sofía tried to finish the phrase gently, as if gentleness could shield her, but the stares sharpened, turning her red uniform into a target. She wasn't being watched because she was impressive. She was being watched because she was out of place, and the most powerful man in the room looked wounded. The final note trembled in the air and refused to die quickly, and the silence afterward felt thick enough to taste. Graham took one slow step closer, polished shoes crunching confetti scattered across the floor like mocking stars. He didn't look at her name tag. He looked at her face, studying it the way men like him studied contracts, searching for a flaw, a loophole, a lie. Sofía swallowed, telling herself she only had to survive the shift and disappear into the night. But the room had already decided she was a story to be consumed. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low, controlled, and strangely shaken, like a verdict delivered by a man afraid of the truth. "Where did you learn that song?" Sofía's fingers stayed on the keys as if lifting them would make the whole room collapse. The billionaire's question hung in the air, perfectly measured, quietly deadly. "Where did you learn that song?" For a second no one breathed, and then the party tried to restart itself in awkward pieces. A forced laugh here, a cough there, a chair scraping as someone shifted to get a better view. The chandelier light didn't soften anything, it only made every expression easier to read. Sofía felt her cheeks heat, but she kept her face still, the way her mother taught her to when the world wanted a reaction. Graham Whitmore didn't move like an angry man, not yet. He moved like a man who had just seen a ghost and was deciding whether to chase it or run from it. His eyes were fixed on Sofía, not with desire or admiration, but with the sharpness of someone rechecking a memory he had sworn was false. Around him, the guests began to understand that this wasn't a cute moment, not a holiday surprise. It was something personal, something old, and the rich had no respect for old pain unless it entertained them. A few phones stayed raised, recording greedily, while others lowered theirs, suddenly afraid of what they might capture. Mr. Klein rushed forward with a smile that was too bright, trying to stitch the evening back together before it tore. "Sir, I'm so sorry," he said, voice sugary, hands hovering in helpless gestures. "She's just staff. She didn't mean—" His words died when Graham lifted a single finger, not even looking at him. Power didn't need volume. It only needed certainty. Sofía watched Mr. Klein shrink by inches, his confidence melting into obedience, and she realized the room belonged to Graham in a way she never could. Even the piano felt borrowed. "I learned it from my mother," Sofía said, surprised at how steady her voice sounded. The sentence was simple, harmless, but the moment it left her mouth, she felt the floor tilt beneath it. Graham's gaze tightened, as if that answer had struck a hidden nerve. "Your mother," he repeated slowly, like he was tasting the words and finding something bitter inside. Sofía nodded, forcing herself to hold his stare without flinching, even though her hands wanted to fold into her lap. The melody still echoed in her ears, and with it came a memory of her mother's warning. Some songs don't belong to the world. Graham stepped closer, until Sofía could smell the sharp, expensive scent of his cologne, clean, cold, untouchable. He lowered his voice, but the room leaned in anyway, because even whispers from men like him carried command. "What is her name?" he asked. Sophia's throat tightened, not from fear alone, but from the strange feeling that her answer might change the rest of her life. She opened her mouth, then hesitated, hearing her mother's hum in the back of her mind like a caution bell. And in that hesitation, Graham's expression shifted, just slightly, as if he recognized the shape of a truth he had spent years refusing to see. Before the chandeliers, before the polished marble and the crystal laughter, Sofía Morales belonged to a quieter kind of light, the kind that came from a small kitchen lamp and a mother's hands. Their apartment smelled of warm rice, cheap soap, and the faint sweetness of laundry drying near the window. Her mother, Elena Morales, moved through that space like someone carrying both love and exhaustion in the same breath, humming as she folded clothes, tapping rhythms on the countertop when the world felt too heavy to speak about. Sofía learned early that poverty had its own soundtrack, buses sighing at corners, neighbors arguing through thin walls, the soft click of coins counted twice because there was never enough. And yet, in the middle of all that, Elena guarded one melody as if it were holy. Elena never called it a song the way other people did. She treated it like a memory that could bite if you held it wrong. She'd sit at the thrift store keyboard they bought from a church sale, fingers gentle, posture careful, and she'd make Sofía repeat the notes until the rhythm lived in her bones. "Not too fast," Elena would say, smiling without showing her teeth, eyes drifting to a place Sofía couldn't follow. "This one breathes." When Sofía asked who wrote it, Elena would smooth her daughter's hair and answer with something that sounded like an ending. "Someone who loved too young." Then she'd close the lid of the keyboard like she was closing a door. In the years that followed, Sofía watched her mother grow quieter about the past. Some nights Elena would wake from sleep with her hand on her chest as if she'd been running in a dream, and she'd sit at the edge of the bed staring at nothing until morning softened the corners of the room. Once, when Sofía was 15, she found a folded piece of paper inside a cookbook, music notes sketched in careful ink, the title written at the top, and then crossed out so hard the page wrinkled. Elena snatched it away with a suddenness that frightened them both, then held Sofía's face between her palms like a plea. "Promise me," she whispered, voice thin as thread, "if you ever have to play it only when it matters." By 19, "when it matters" had started sounding like a luxury Sofía couldn't afford. Bills arrived like threats, work hours stretched, and Elena's cough became the kind that didn't leave the room even after the sound stopped. Sofía took shifts anywhere she could, cafes, banquet halls, weddings where people argued about flower colors while she balanced trays with aching wrists. When the New Year's party at Whitmore's estate came along, the paycheck looked like breathing space, just enough to get through the next month without panic. Elena was already too tired to ask questions, too tired to warn her, and Sofía didn't want to add fear to the list of things her mother carried. So she put on the red uniform, pinned on her name tag, and told herself it was just one night. Just sparkling people, just borrowed elegance, just a few hours of smiling until her cheeks hurt. She didn't bring the melody on purpose, not like a weapon or a trick. It was simply there, tucked into her hands the way some prayers are tucked into a person's mouth without them noticing. But as she sat at that grand piano with Mr. Klein's pressure at her back and a room full of strangers waiting to be entertained, a single forgotten detail rose from memory like a match struck in the dark. Elena, half asleep, whispering one name only once, as if saying it twice might summon something dangerous. Graham. Back in the ballroom, Sofía felt the weight of her own hesitation like a stone in her mouth. The name Graham hadn't left her lips, yet the way Graham Whitmore watched her made it feel as if he had heard it anyway, as if he could read the places her mother had stitched shut. Mr. Klein hovered beside the piano with panic sweating through his politeness, smiling at the guests as though he could laugh this moment back into harmlessness. But nothing was harmless anymore. The air had changed, and everyone could taste it. "Sir," Mr. Klein began again, voice too bright, hands fluttering. "She's new, she's tired, she doesn't understand." Graham lifted his hand, and the sentence died before it could be finished. He didn't raise his voice or lean forward. He didn't have to. The room obeyed him the way a body obeys pain, instantly, without debate. Then he turned his attention fully to Sofía, and the focus felt like a spotlight tightening, hot and inescapable. Sofía forced her shoulders back, even as her stomach turned cold. "I learned it from my mother," she repeated, careful not to tremble, careful not to sound like she was begging. "She taught me when I was little. I didn't know it was something." Graham's jaw flexed at the word something, as if it insulted him. His eyes dropped briefly to her hands, as though measuring the distance between those fingers and an old memory he couldn't touch anymore. Around them, the guests leaned in with polished curiosity, women with glittering earrings, men with expensive smiles, waiting for the rich man's reaction the way children wait for a magician's next trick. "Your mother," Graham said again, slower this time. He drew the phrase out like a thread pulled from a seam, watching to see what else might unravel. "What is her full name?" The question landed softly, but Sofía felt its edge. She could almost hear Elena's voice in her ear, warning her that some answers opened doors that couldn't be closed again. Sophia's throat tightened. She glanced at Mr. Klein for a fraction of a second, but his eyes were pleading for obedience, not protection. "Elena Morales," Sofía finally said, keeping her tone steady, as if steadiness could shield her. A murmur rippled through the room, some people amused, some irritated that the tension had become messy. But Graham's face did something else entirely. The sharp control didn't vanish, not completely, yet a crack appeared beneath it, a small break in the marble. He blinked once, hard as if clearing a blur, and for the first time he looked less like a billionaire and more like a man startled by his own heartbeat. He stepped closer to the piano, close enough that Sofía could see the fine strain at the corner of his eyes, the exhaustion hidden under wealth. "Where is she now?" he asked, and the room seemed to lean toward the answer. Sophia's mouth went dry. She thought of her mother's cough, of the way Elena's hands shook when she tried to lift a pot, of the quiet bravery in her smile when she didn't want her daughter to worry. Sofía swallowed, and in that small pause, Graham's expression sharpened again, because he could sense what she didn't want to say, and he was already bracing for it. Sophia's eyes flicked down to the polished black of the piano, where chandelier light trembled like water, and she heard herself answer before she could soften it. "She's not well," she said, and the words felt like a betrayal of Elena's pride. A few guests exchanged looks that carried the same cold amusement people reserve for other people's troubles, as if hardship were a costume Sofía had worn to the party. Graham Whitmore's face stayed controlled, but the muscle in his jaw tightened, and the room sensed it, an invisible signal that this was no longer entertainment. Mr. Klein tried to laugh, tried to wave it away with a joke, but his voice came out thin and weak. Then a woman in a champagne-colored dress tilted her head and smiled with practiced cruelty. "Oh, how touching," she said, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "A tragic mother and a mysterious song. What's next? A fundraiser." A few people chuckled, not because it was funny, but because laughing kept them on the safe side of power. Sofía felt heat rise in her cheeks, sharp and humiliating, and she clenched her hands beneath the edge of the bench so no one would see them shake. She wanted to stand, to walk away, to let the rich keep their noise and their glitter, but the room had a way of turning exits into walls. Mr. Klein stepped in quickly, eager to please the guests more than he was eager to protect his staff. "Sofía, honey," he murmured through his smile, leaning close as if offering comfort, but his whisper was a warning. "Don't make a scene. Just answer him. Be respectful." The word respectful tasted bitter in her mouth, because respect in that room only ever flowed upward. Sofía swallowed and looked toward the edge of the ballroom, where security stood like statues in black suits, already watching her as if she were a problem waiting to happen. She understood with a sinking clarity that her job could vanish with a single raised eyebrow. Graham's gaze never left her. "Play it again," he said, and the order was so calm it was almost gentle, until she realized gentleness could still be a blade. Sofía hesitated, and the woman in the champagne dress sighed theatrically. "Oh, don't be shy," she added, eyes bright with the joy of putting someone smaller in their place. Sofía lowered her fingers because refusing would only feed them, and because part of her, some stubborn, frightened part, needed to prove this had never been a trick. She played the chorus, the part Elena always taught her to treat like a held breath. The melody unfurled across the ballroom, and something changed in Graham Whitmore's face, fast and involuntary. His lips parted, and though he made no sound, Sofía saw it clearly. He mouthed the next note before it arrived, as if his body remembered the music more honestly than his pride ever could. The guests didn't understand what they were seeing, but they felt it, and the silence that followed the chorus wasn't polite anymore. It was afraid, because the powerful man in the room was starting to look like someone who could break. Graham Whitmore didn't speak right away. He stared at Sofía as if the last note had slipped beneath his ribs and lodged there, sharp and undeniable. And the longer he stayed silent, the more the guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Pride held him upright. Pride and habit and the kind of control that had built his empire, yet something older than his empire was moving behind his eyes. Finally he turned, not toward Sofía, but toward the room, and the way he looked at the guests made their curiosity feel suddenly dangerous. In that single glance, laughter died, phones lowered, and the party remembered who owned the air it was breathing. "Enough," he said. Not loud, not angry, worse than angry, because it was final. Then he looked back at Sofía and nodded once toward the side hallway, as if she were a document he needed to examine in private. Mr. Klein hurried forward, trying to attach himself to the situation like a servant hoping to be praised. "Sir, I can handle—" Graham cut him off with the same calm. "Not you." The words landed like a slap, and Mr. Klein's face tightened, his smile cracking at the edges, but he stepped back, because disobedience was not an option in that house. Security moved in, 2 men in black, not rough but unmistakable, forming a corridor that didn't feel like an invitation. Sofia's stomach dropped. "I didn't do anything," she whispered, though no one had accused her out loud yet, and sometimes that was the cruelest part, being treated as guilty without the dignity of a charge. Graham walked ahead, and she followed because the alternative was a scene, and a scene would belong to the guests forever. Past the ballroom doors, the sound of celebration grew muffled, replaced by the quiet hum of expensive hallways, the kind where even footsteps sounded too loud. Somewhere behind them, the countdown chants resumed, but they felt like they were happening in another world. He led her into a private lounge that smelled faintly of leather and cedar, where the lighting was warm, but the silence was cold. Framed photographs lined one wall, charity galas, ribbon cuttings, handshakes with important people, proof of a life built on image and certainty. Sofía stood near the door, hands clasped tight in front of her, while Graham moved to a side table and poured himself water as if his hands needed something to do. He drank without looking at her, then set the glass down with care, like he was afraid of breaking anything else. "Tell me again," he said, voice lower now, "exactly how your mother taught you that." Sofía drew a shaky breath and tried to keep her story plain, simple, untouchable. "She used to hum it while she cooked," she said. "She made me practice it on our keyboard. She said it was important." Graham's eyes flicked up at the word important, and something tight flashed across his face. Anger, maybe, or grief dressed as anger. He took a step closer, and Sofía noticed for the first time a small scar near his left eyebrow, faint but real, as if his past had left marks even money couldn't erase. "What else did she say?" he asked, and when Sofía hesitated, his voice sharpened. "What names did she mention?" Sofía's gaze drifted past him, to a corner of the room, where one framed photo sat slightly turned away, half hidden behind a tall vase. It wasn't a gala or a boardroom shot. It was older, softer, like it belonged to a life Graham kept locked up. She couldn't see the face clearly, but she could sense the weight of it, the way a memory sits heavy even when you refuse to look at it. Her throat tightened. "She didn't like talking about the past," Sofía said carefully. "She just taught me the song." Graham's jaw clenched, and for a moment his control returned like armor sliding into place. He turned away from her and snapped his fingers once, and his assistant appeared at the door, as if summoned by fear. "Run a background check," Graham said. "Now, everything. Addresses, schools, family, employment, everything." The assistant hesitated, eyes flicking to Sofía with a hint of discomfort, but nodded and disappeared. Sofía's chest tightened with anger she didn't feel safe to show. "I'm not a criminal," she said softly. Graham didn't turn around, but his voice answered her like a wall. "No," he said, each word measured. "You are a question." The clock somewhere in the house chimed faintly, reminding Sofía that midnight was approaching, that the world outside this lounge was celebrating while hers was being taken apart. Graham finally faced her again, and the look in his eyes was a mixture of suspicion and something that scared her more. Hope he didn't know how to carry. "That song," he said, quieter now, "was written for someone who died." Sofía felt a chill pass through her, because Elena had never spoken of death when she hummed it, only of pain. And before she could stop herself, the truth slipped out in a whisper that cut the air clean in two. "My mother didn't." For a moment, the words Sofía had whispered seemed too small to survive in that expensive lounge, yet they landed with the force of a slammed door. Graham Whitmore stared at her, as if she had just denied the rules of the world he lived by, as if she had taken a truth he'd sealed away and cracked it open with one sentence. His eyes narrowed, not because he was sure she was lying, but because he was afraid she might not be. He inhaled slowly, the kind of breath men take when they're about to make a decision that will be called necessary later, even if it's cruel. "Then you understand why I need answers," he said, and the calm in his voice felt like a warning dressed as reason. He didn't keep her upstairs. He brought her back down. The hallway opened into the ballroom again, and Sofía felt the room's gaze hit her like cold water. The countdown energy had returned, glasses refilled, laughter restarted, but it faltered when Graham entered with her behind him, as though the party sensed a storm walking in. Mr. Klein rushed forward, eyes wide, trying to read Graham's face like a survival manual, and the guests leaned in with eager smiles, hoping the scandal would blossom into something they could talk about for weeks. Graham lifted his hand and the music stopped. The quiet that followed was not gentle, it was hungry. "This young woman," Graham said, voice carrying without effort, "has introduced herself into a private matter." The words were careful, polished, and they wrapped the room in permission to judge. A ripple of murmurs followed. Con artist, gold digger, setup, spoken softly but loud enough to sting. Sophia's stomach clenched, and she tried to take a step back, but security subtly shifted, closing the space behind her without touching her. Mr. Klein's face hardened in relief, as if Graham had just given him the excuse he needed to throw Sofía under the bus. "Sir, we can call the police," he offered quickly, almost eager. "If you believe—" Graham's gaze cut toward him, and Mr. Klein swallowed the rest of the sentence. Graham turned back to Sofía, his expression unreadable, and said, "Tell them. Tell them how you know every pause." The room waited, and Sofía felt something inside her snap. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. She wasn't a performer. She wasn't a thief. She was a daughter trying to pay rent, and now she stood in front of $1,000 centerpiece like she was on trial. "I learned it from my mother," she said again, louder this time, because silence had stopped protecting her. "That's all. I didn't come here for—" A woman in a glittering shawl scoffed. "They never do," she whispered, and several people laughed. Graham's voice lowered, but it still carried like a blade. "That song was never recorded," he said, and the room stilled again, sensing the shift. It was never published. It was never performed publicly. He took one step forward, eyes fixed on Sofía. "And yet you know it perfectly." The sentence wasn't an accusation. It was a wall closing in. Sophia's mouth went dry because she realized what he was truly saying. "The only way you know it is if someone who knew me taught you." And the wealthy guests felt it too, even if they didn't understand the details. They understood the danger of a powerful man cornered by a past he didn't control. Sophia's vision blurred for a second, not from tears, but from the sudden fear that she might not even make it home tonight. Her job was already gone in Mr. Klein's eyes. Her dignity was already gone in the guests' laughter. She stood there in her red uniform, under a banner promising a happy new year, while her life quietly fell apart. And then, just as the room tightened around her, a staff member slipped through the crowd and came close enough to brush Sophia's elbow, as if by accident. In that small, hidden motion, something was pressed into Sophia's hand, a sealed envelope. Sofía looked down. Her name was written on it, in familiar handwriting, soft, slightly slanted, unmistakably her mother's. And in that instant, with fireworks beginning to crack outside and the clock rushing toward midnight, Sofía understood with a sinking certainty that the song had never been forbidden because it was beautiful. It had been forbidden because it was a key. Sofía didn't open the envelope in the ballroom. She couldn't. The air was too crowded with eyes, with judgment, with that sharp kind of curiosity that turned suffering into dessert. She slid it into the pocket of her apron, as if hiding it could keep it safe, then stood very still while the room pretended to be civilized. Graham Whitmore watched her like a man watching a match hover near dry paper. and Mr. Klein's face had already decided she was disposable. Outside the tall windows, fireworks began to bloom, bright, loud, celebratory, while inside, Sofia's world narrowed to the weight of that sealed paper against her ribs. Security guided her away, not with hands, but with bodies placed where her choices used to be. They brought her to the staff corridor, a place of fluorescent lights and scuffed walls that didn't sparkle no matter how much the mansion did. The music from the party filtered in like a distant lie, muffled and cheerful, while Sofia's breath came short and uneven. Her fingers found the envelope through the fabric of her apron, tracing the curves of her own name in her mother's handwriting. Elena Morales had died with too many things unsaid. Sofía knew that in her bones, and yet here was her voice, waiting behind a seal, arriving on the one night the past had risen like a tide. In the cramped staff room, she finally let herself sit. A plastic chair, a vending machine humming, a clock ticking too loudly. Nothing in that space matched the velvet and crystal outside. She pulled the envelope out with trembling hands, and for a second she just stared at it, as if it might vanish if she blinked. She remembered her mother's last weeks, the cough that stole breath, the way Elena would press her hand to her chest and look away when Sofía asked if she was scared. She remembered one sentence Elena had whispered on a night when the electricity flickered and the apartment felt colder than usual. There are things you forgive, even when you don't understand why. Sofía had thought it was about life being unfair, not about a man with a mansion. Her nails caught the edge of the seal and tore it slowly, almost gently, as if rushing would be disrespectful. Inside was a folded letter, the paper creased and handled, its corners softened as though it had been carried for years. The first lines were written in ink that looked slightly faded, like the words had been waiting a long time for the right moment to breathe. Sofia's throat tightened as she read because her mother's voice came back to her in every curve of every letter, tender, tired, determined. The letter spoke of love and a promise, of youth and a mistake, of a door that closed and never opened again. And with every sentence, Sofía felt the mansion upstairs shift from a workplace into a stage her mother had prepared long before she ever took this job. Near the end, the handwriting pressed harder, as if Elena's hand had shaken while writing, as if she'd fought tears and refused to let them win. Sofia's eyes blurred anyway, and a drop fell onto the page, smudging a word she read twice to make sure it was real. The final line didn't sound like a goodbye, it sounded like instructions, precise and haunting, like a plan laid down with love and fear braided together. Sofía swallowed, holding the paper closer to the light, and read it again, slower this time because it changed everything. When you meet him, play our song first. Sofía sat there with the letter trembling in her hands, the fluorescent light turning the paper pale, almost sickly, as if truth itself looked different outside the ballroom. The words our song echoed inside her chest because they didn't sound like a lesson anymore. They sounded like a link, a thread tying her mother to Graham Whitmore with a knot she'd never seen. From the hallway, muffled cheers rose and fell, the party swelling toward midnight as if nothing in the world could possibly be wrong. Sofía pressed her fingertips to her eyelids, trying to steady her breathing, trying to keep herself from being swallowed by the thought that Elena had planned this moment. And in the middle of her fear, she realized something else, quieter but sharper. Her mother had trusted her enough to place the first move in her hands. The staff room door opened softly, and an older man stepped in with the careful hesitation of someone who had spent a lifetime being overlooked. He wore a simple black suit that didn't fit the way the rich men's suits did, and his hands were marked with the faint stiffness of age and long practice. Sofía recognized him, the hired pianist who'd been playing earlier in the evening before Mr. Klein decided she should entertain the guests. He carried a glass of water and a napkin like offerings. not questions. "Miss," he said gently, and his voice had the calm of someone who understood panic without feeding it. "Drink. Your hands are shaking." Sofía took the water, grateful in a way that made her throat burn. He didn't demand the letter, didn't push into her space, only sat in the chair across from her, as if kindness were a form of respect. "I heard what happened out there," he said, eyes lowering briefly, as if embarrassed on her behalf. "That room forgets people are human." Sofía swallowed and nodded, unable to find the right words, because the right words felt too heavy for her tongue. The older man glanced at the envelope in her lap, then looked away again, giving her the choice to speak. "My name is Harold Bennett," he offered, like a hand extended at a distance. "If you want to tell me nothing, that's fine, but if you want to understand what you're holding, I can help you read it with a steadier heart." Sofía hesitated, then unfolded the letter again, the paper whispering like a secret being reopened. Harold leaned forward just enough to see, not enough to invade, and together they followed Elena's handwriting line by line. When Sofía reached the part about the song being the only door left, her breath caught. Harold's eyebrows lifted at a date scribbled near the margin, and he pointed gently, as if afraid of hurting the ink. "This," he said, "isn't just emotion, it's coordinates." He tapped the place name that followed, small, precise, then the name Elena had written with a firmness that made Sofía's stomach twist. "Do you know this name?" Harold asked quietly, and Sofía shook her head, but the letters looked familiar in a way that made her skin prickle. Harold's gaze drifted to the staff room clock, then back to Sofía, and his kindness didn't change, but it became urgent. "Whitmore's biography," he said carefully, "mentions a town like this, mentions a scholarship he won as a teenager, mentions a church recital years ago." Sofía stared at him, heart thudding, because it felt impossible that her mother's quiet life and this man's public legend could overlap. She read the lines again, and suddenly the letter wasn't just a confession, it was a map. Elena hadn't wanted Sofía to beg or to accuse or to perform. She wanted her daughter to arrive at the truth with her spine straight. Harold's voice softened. "Whatever this is," he said, "your mother wrote it so you wouldn't be alone." The door opened again, and this time the air that entered was colder. A young man in a tailored suit, Graham's assistant, stood in the frame with a face that looked carefully composed, except for the trembling in his hands. His eyes flicked to Sofía, then to Harold, then back again as if he was afraid of what he was about to say. "Miss Morales," he murmured, swallowing hard, "Mr. Whitmore wants you upstairs." He paused, and in that pause Sofía felt the whole mansion holding its breath. "And he asked me to bring you gently," the assistant added like a confession of his own fear, "because he's not sure he can stay standing if you say no." Sofía followed the assistant through the staff corridor with the letter tucked tight against her chest, as if her mother's handwriting could protect her from what waited upstairs. The mansion felt different away from the ballroom, quieter, wider, built for secrets instead of celebration. Her shoes made small sounds on the polished floor, and each step seemed to carry her further from the girl who had only wanted to finish a shift and go home. Harold Bennett didn't come with her, but he gave her a look before she left. Steady, encouraging, the way a grandfather might look at someone walking into a storm with nothing but faith. The assistant moved carefully, like he was escorting something fragile, and Sofía couldn't tell if the fragile thing was her or the man she was about to face. They reached a private floor where the air smelled faintly of cedar and expensive quiet. The assistant knocked once, then opened the door without waiting for permission, as if permission had already been granted by the house itself. Inside, Graham Whitmore stood near a tall window, the fireworks outside painting quick colors across his face, red, gold, white, like fleeting masks. He didn't turn at first. His shoulders were rigid, and his hands were clasped behind his back in the posture of a man trying to keep himself from shaking. When he finally looked over, his eyes were sharper than before, but there was fear in them now too. Fear of being wrong, fear of being right, fear of something he could never buy his way out of. "Close the door," Graham said to the assistant, and the click that followed sounded like the lock on a confession. Sofía stayed near the entrance, refusing to step deeper into his space until she understood what kind of room this was. An interrogation, a trap, or a moment her mother had designed for truth. Graham's gaze dropped to the envelope in her hands, and his throat moved like he swallowed something bitter. "You said your mother is alive," he began, voice controlled but strained at the edges, "and you said she taught you that song." He took a slow step toward a side table, then pulled open a drawer and removed a worn notebook. Old paper, edges frayed, the kind of thing that didn't belong in a mansion unless it was kept like a relic. He placed the notebook on the table and opened it with care, like opening a wound. Sofía saw messy teenage handwriting, music staff lines, ink that had pressed too hard in places, as if the person writing had been furious with his own feelings. Graham slid it across toward her, without touching her, as though he didn't trust his hands. "I wrote it," he said, "and the words didn't sound proud. When I was 17. Sofía's eyes traced the notes, and a chill spread through her, because the melody on that page matched what lived in her fingers. Every rise, every pause, every aching turn, her mother had insisted she respect. The room felt suddenly smaller, as if the distance between Sofía's life and Graham's life had collapsed into a single sheet of paper. Graham let out a breath that didn't look like relief, only surrender. "It was for someone I loved," he said, staring at the notebook as if it might answer for him. "Someone I thought I lost, someone I convinced myself was gone, because that was the only way to survive what I did." His jaw tightened, and for a moment anger flickered, not at Sofía but at himself. "I made a decision," he continued, the words coming slower now, "and I called it protecting my future. I called it being smart." He looked up at Sofía, and the power in his gaze was still there, but it was cracked by something softer, something human. "Tell me her name again," he said. "Your mother's full name." Sofía's palms were damp against the envelope. She wanted to stay cold, to stay guarded, because warmth in a room like this could become weakness. But her mother's letter had burned a path inside her, and she couldn't pretend she wasn't standing at the edge of the truth. "Elena Morales," she said clearly, forcing each syllable to hold. The fireworks outside burst again, bright enough to turn the window into a white flare, and when the light faded, Graham Whitmore looked different, like gravity had finally caught him. His knees bent slightly, just for a second, as if his body had forgotten it was supposed to be unbreakable. He reached for the back of a chair, steadying himself without sitting, and his voice came out almost as a whisper, rawer than Sofía expected from a man like him. "Elena," he repeated, like a prayer he hadn't spoken in decades. And in that single word, Sofía felt the past step fully into the room. Graham kept his hand on the chair, as if it were the only solid thing left in the room. The fireworks outside continued to bloom and fade, but he stared past them, eyes fixed on a point inside his own memory where time had stopped being kind. When he spoke again, the billionaire polish returned, just enough to protect him from falling apart. "A name is not proof," he said, voice measured, but Sofía could hear the tremor underneath, like a wire stretched too tight. "People lie for money every day." The words were cold, yet they sounded less like an accusation and more like a desperate attempt to build a wall before the truth reached him completely. Sofía's chest tightened with anger that surprised her. She had been humiliated in front of strangers, treated like a thief, marched through hallways like a problem to be contained, and now she was being asked to prove she wasn't a trap. She lifted her chin, eyes shining not with tears, but with refusal. "I don't want your money," she said, steady and sharp. "I don't want anything from you. I didn't even know who you were until tonight. I played that song because my mother taught it to me." Her fingers pressed into the envelope, and she realized the paper wasn't just fragile. It was heavy with everything Elena never said out loud. "You want proof?" Sofía added. "Then read what she wrote." Graham didn't reach for the letter immediately. Pride held him back, the same pride that had kept him alive through boardrooms and betrayals. But fear pushed harder. Finally, he nodded once, a small motion that looked like surrender, and Sofía stepped forward just enough to place the letter on the table beside the worn notebook. Graham unfolded it slowly, as if speed might shatter him. His eyes moved across Elena's handwriting, and with each line his face changed in careful, controlled increments, like a man watching a dam crack and trying to calculate how much water will come through. When he reached the middle, his breath caught. "There," he murmured almost to himself, tapping the page with a fingertip that trembled. "That isn't possible." Sofía leaned in, and her heart thudded when she saw what he meant. Elena had written details that didn't belong to anyone but him. A small scar near his left eyebrow, the way he used to bite the inside of his cheek when nervous, the oak tree behind a church where he once promised he would come back. Graham swallowed hard, eyes fixed on those lines as if they were burning. "Only one person knew that," he whispered, and for the first time the word trap sounded ridiculous, because no stranger could have invented a memory that specific. Still, pride fought mercy like it always did. Graham's eyes narrowed again, searching for a final escape. "A letter can be forged," he said, but his voice was weaker now, as if he didn't believe his own argument. Sofía's patience snapped, not into screaming, but into something firmer, truth with its back straight. She reached into the envelope again and pulled out what Elena had tucked behind the paper. A small hospital bracelet, yellowed with time, its plastic scratched as if it had been carried in a pocket for years. And beneath it, an old photograph. Sofía laid the photo on the table. Her mother stood in it, younger, visibly pregnant, one hand resting protectively on her belly. Beside her was a young man in a suit that looked too big, like he was still growing into himself. But the photo had been torn, ripped right across the young man's face, as if someone had tried to erase him. Graham's breath stopped. His gaze locked onto the hand in the picture, because that part wasn't torn, and on one finger was a ring, simple, unmistakable, engraved with the Whitmore crest. The room seemed to tilt as Graham reached out, fingertips hovering over the image without touching it, like he was afraid the proof would vanish if he dared. His voice came out hoarse, stripped of wealth and power and control. "That ring," he whispered. And in the silence that followed, Sofía realized something terrifying and undeniable. Her mother hadn't just left a story behind. She had left evidence that could rewrite a life. Graham Whitmore stared at the photograph as if it were a weapon laid gently on his own table. For a long moment he didn't speak, and in that silence his control didn't look powerful. It looked exhausted, like a man who had been holding his breath for 20 years and was finally running out of air. He lifted his eyes to Sofía, and the billionaire in him tried to return, tried to harden his face into certainty. "This could be a setup," he said, but the words sounded rehearsed, like something he'd once told himself to survive. Sofía felt her hands curl into fists at her sides, not to fight him, but to keep herself from shaking. The door opened without knocking, and the head of security stepped in, as if he had been listening the whole time. He was broad-shouldered, calm and careful. Marcus Hale, a man trained to protect Graham's world from surprises. "Sir," Marcus said, eyes flicking to Sofía and then to the items on the table, "we ran what we could. She's clean, no criminal record, no history of fraud." He placed a thin folder down, but his posture stayed guarded, as if truth didn't automatically mean safety. "Still," Marcus added, "people can be used. Someone could be feeding her information." The assistant stood behind him, pale and tense, like he wanted to disagree but didn't know how. Sofia's chest tightened. Even now, even with her mother's handwriting staring up from the table, they were building a story where she was a tool, a trick, a threat. She stepped forward, voice steady but trembling at the edges with years of swallowed frustration. "I'm not a weapon," she said. "I'm not a plan. I'm not your enemy." Her eyes burned as she looked at Graham, refusing to let him hide behind suspicion. "I grew up counting groceries and watching my mother pretend she wasn't tired. I watched her get sick and still smile so I wouldn't be afraid. And all my life there was a hole where a father should have been, silent, unexplained, like a locked door in a house you live in every day." Graham's jaw worked as if he were chewing on guilt he couldn't swallow. "If Elena was alive," he began, and the words cracked mid-sentence, revealing the boy beneath the billionaire. He tried again, colder this time, because cold was safer. "Why didn't she come back?" Sofia's eyes flashed. "Maybe she did," she said, and the anger in her voice wasn't loud, but it was sharp. "Maybe she tried and got pushed away. Maybe she didn't want to be humiliated again. Or maybe she thought the only way to keep me safe was to keep you far away." She tapped the letter gently but firmly. "She didn't write this because she wanted revenge. She wrote it because she was dying and she didn't want me to live in the dark anymore." Marcus shifted, uncomfortable, as if compassion wasn't part of his job description. But Graham didn't look at him. Graham looked at Sofia like a man staring at the edge of a cliff he built himself. His voice dropped, quiet and raw. "I didn't know," he said, and for the first time the phrase didn't sound like an excuse. It sounded like a confession that hurt. Sofia breathed in, slow, trying to keep herself from falling into either hope or hatred too quickly. In the distance, the mansion's party roared toward midnight, but up here, time had changed into something heavier, something honest. And as Graham's eyes returned to the torn photograph, Sofia realized the next question wasn't whether he believed her anymore. It was whether he had the courage to face who stole the truth from both of them. Graham Whitmore didn't call the party back to order. He didn't return to the ballroom to reclaim his image. Instead, he stood in that private room like a man finally forced to watch the truth without blinking, his gaze fixed on the torn photograph and the ring that had survived someone's attempt to erase him. "Find the church," he told Marcus Hale. And the command didn't sound like power anymore. It sounded like urgency. Marcus nodded once and stepped out, already dialing contacts, already moving through the world Graham owned. Sofia stayed where she was, letter in hand, feeling the strange weight of being both witness and evidence, and wondering if the next blow would come from Graham, or from the people who had shaped him. Minutes passed with a silence that felt louder than fireworks. Graham paced once, then stopped, rubbing the bridge of his nose like he could press the years back into place. "My family," he began, but the sentence wouldn't finish, as if even saying it out loud threatened to collapse something he had built his whole life on. He looked at Sofia then, really looked, at her tired eyes, at the way she held herself, as if she had learned to stay upright without being held. For the first time, his voice softened without turning weak. "How is she?" he asked, and the question hurt more than suspicion, because it arrived too late. Sofia swallowed. "She's gone," she said simply, and her words were steady, but the grief beneath them was deep and old. Graham's face tightened, not in anger, but in a kind of stunned remorse, as if a door had slammed shut forever and he had been running toward it without knowing. He turned back to the window, watching a burst of gold flare in the sky, and his reflection looked smaller than the man himself. "I thought she died years ago," he said, almost whispering. "That's what I was told." Sofia's stomach clenched, because even in that sentence she could hear it, the hint of someone else's hands shaping the story, guiding him away from Elena, guiding Elena away from him. When Marcus returned, he wasn't alone. A frail, older man stood beside him, wearing a simple coat and a worn clerical collar, his hair white, his hands trembling slightly, as if age had turned time into a physical weight. "Mr. Whitmore," Marcus said, voice careful, "this is Pastor Edwin Shaw, retired." The pastor's eyes moved to Sofía, then to the letter, then to Graham, and something in his expression softened into sorrow. "I was there," Pastor Shaw said quietly. "Back then, I remember Elena. I remember you." Graham's shoulders pulled tight, as if he'd been bracing for an impact and finally heard it coming. Pastor Shaw spoke gently, but the truth he carried had edges. He explained the youth recital at the church, the oak tree behind the building, the way Graham and Elena had stayed after everyone left, sitting on the steps like two teenagers convinced love could outlast anything. Then his voice lowered, and the room seemed to shrink around his next words. "Your father came to me," the pastor said, "not alone. There were men with him. They offered money for the church renovations, and they offered Elena a choice that wasn't truly a choice." Graham's face went pale, the color draining as if every bright moment in his life had been built on a hidden theft. "They said she would ruin you," Pastor Shaw continued, eyes sad. "They said your future belonged to the family, not to your heart. And Elena—" He paused, swallowing hard. "Elena left because she believed you'd be safer if she disappeared." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of the sound of a man realizing his control had always been fear wearing a tailored suit. Graham's mouth opened, but no words came, only breath, shaken and thin. He looked at Sofía again, and in his eyes there was no longer suspicion, only shame, heavy and undeniable. His voice finally broke through, quieter than Sofía had ever heard it. "All these years," he murmured, "I thought I abandoned her." He swallowed, staring at the torn photo as if it could forgive him. "But she was taken from me." Then he turned back to Sofía, and the power in him rearranged itself into something unfamiliar, something almost humble. "Play it again," he said softly. "Not for them, not for the party, for her, and for the life I ruined without even knowing." Sofía returned to the grand piano, but this time she wasn't placed there like a centerpiece. The room around her had changed. No laughter curling through the air, no glittering voices competing to be heard, only a hush that felt earned, like everyone had finally remembered that pain is not a show. She set Elena's letter beside the worn notebook, and the two pieces of paper looked like they belonged together, as if they had been waiting years to meet on the same surface. Her fingers hovered for a breath, then lowered, and the melody rose again, softer than before, carrying warmth into a house that had always felt cold. Even the distant fireworks outside seemed to fade, as if the night itself had chosen to listen. Graham didn't stand behind her like a shadow anymore. He pulled a chair near the piano and sat slowly, carefully, as if the wrong movement might break what little truth had survived. The billionaire in him still existed. Sofía could feel it in the way the room respected his silence, but something else sat beside it now, something smaller and more honest. His hands hovered over the keys without claiming them, as though he didn't trust himself to touch what he had once created. When Sofía reached the chorus, he pressed a single note with her, quiet, precise, trembling, not as a performance, but as a confession. Two hands, one song, and for the first time that night the mansion held them without cruelty. When the last phrase settled into stillness, Graham's breath came uneven, like a man learning how to breathe after years underwater. He stared at the keys as if they were the only place he could speak without lying. "I can't return what was stolen," he said, voice low, stripped of his usual certainty. "Not the years, not the choices made in my name, not the love I lost by believing the wrong people." His eyes lifted to Sofía, and there was no bargaining in them, no polished charm, no threats. "But I can give you what I never learned to give anyone," he continued. "My time, my name, my presence, without conditions, even if you decide you don't want any of it." Then he slid the notebook toward her with both hands, offering it like something sacred rather than something expensive. Sofía didn't forgive him, not in that moment, because forgiveness wasn't a switch that flipped when a man finally sounded sorry. She felt the old anger rise, sharp, protective, alongside a longing she didn't know how to name, the longing of a life spent wondering who was missing and why. She glanced at the torn photograph, then at her mother's handwriting, and her chest tightened with the ache of Elena's quiet courage. "My mother didn't want revenge," Sofía said, the words steady even as her eyes burned. "She wanted the truth to stop poisoning the future." Graham nodded once and didn't try to buy comfort with money or promises, didn't try to rush her into softness. He simply listened, and in that listening Sofía felt the smallest space open where healing could someday take root. As the night thinned toward dawn, Sofía gathered the envelope again, intending to fold everything away before it swallowed her whole. That's when her fingers found something she hadn't noticed. A second seal pressed into the inner flap, hidden like a heartbeat behind the first letter. She eased it free and saw another page, separate from the rest, untouched by her tears, marked in Elena's handwriting with a single line. "For Graham, only when he is ready." Nadi, the paper felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried the part of the story meant to decide what came next. Sofía looked up, and Graham was already staring at the sealed page like a man waiting for a sentence he might not survive. Morning didn't arrive with a shout inside Whitmore's mansion. It arrived quietly, like a careful apology. The ballroom downstairs was still dressed in glitter and spilled celebration, but up here the air felt clean, almost new, as if the night had burned away more than fireworks. Sofía held Elena's sealed page between her fingers for a long time before she handed it over, because some truths belong to the right hands at the right moment. Graham took it the way a man takes a fragile heirloom, not daring to bend it, not daring to pretend it was ordinary. Pastor Shaw remained nearby, silent and steady, as if he understood that healing often needs witnesses who don't interrupt. Graham broke the seal slowly. His eyes moved across Elena's final words, and with every line his face softened into something that looked less like power and more like regret, finally given a name. The letter wasn't written to punish him. It was written to release him, and to protect Sofía from carrying a burden that was never meant to be hers alone. Elena asked him to stop fighting the past like an enemy and to stop treating love like a liability, because that kind of fear turns people into ghosts even while they're still alive. She didn't demand money, titles, or public confessions. She asked for something harder and more honest, responsibility without pride and presence without control. By the time Graham reached the last sentence, his shoulders were shaking with a grief he could no longer hide behind wealth. He didn't try to fix everything in a single speech. He didn't offer Sofía a check like a shortcut to forgiveness. Instead, he looked at her with a gentleness that seemed unfamiliar to him, and he said, "I want to do this the slow way, if you'll allow it." Sofía didn't say yes right away, and she didn't say no, because her heart wasn't a door that opened on command. She asked him one thing first, something simple that no one in that mansion had ever asked her before. "Tell me about her, the way you remember her." And Graham did quietly, telling stories of a teenage girl who laughed with her whole face, who believed music could carry people across impossible distances, who once stood under an oak tree and made him promise he wouldn't become a man who forgot how to feel. When daylight fully settled into the windows, Graham made choices that didn't shine like headlines, but mattered more than any headline ever could. He instructed Marcus to find a community music program in Sofia's neighborhood and fund it in Elena Morales' name, not for publicity, but for repair. He arranged for Sofia's mother to be honored with a small scholarship, one that would help young people learn music even if they had no money, the way Elena once had to learn with scraps and hope. And when Mr. Klein tried to scramble excuses about misunderstandings, Graham ended the conversation with a calm finality that didn't need anger. Sofia would never be treated like an object in his home again, and neither would anyone else under his roof. It wasn't a grand redemption, it was the beginning of accountability. Sofia left the mansion after sunrise, the sky pale and open above her like a fresh page. She carried Elena's letter, the notebook, and something else she hadn't carried when she arrived, an answer to the question that had haunted her for years. The answer didn't erase the pain of growing up without a father, and it didn't magically turn Graham into the dad she wished for, but it gave her a truth strong enough to stand on. She understood that her mother's forbidden song hadn't been a trap. It had been a bridge built from love and courage, meant to lead her out of silence. And as she walked toward her own life, she felt the strange peace of knowing that some endings are not endings at all, only beginnings that needed time to arrive. If this story touched your heart, leave a heart in the comments and subscribe for more stories about kindness and redemption. Happy New Year, Happy.